Good morning. Before we get started with today's Bible story, do you remember these verses? Proverbs 20:22. Do not say, I'll pay you back for this wrong. Wait for the Lord, and he will avenge you. Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. In 1 John 1:9. But if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. Listen to today's story. Think about these questions. Number 1. How did God speak to Solomon at Gibeon? Number 2. What did Solomon ask God for? Number 3. Why was God unwilling for King David to build the temple? Number 4. Where did Solomon get wood for the temple building? Number 5. How many years did it take to finish the great temple? And number 6. What sign did God send so the people would know he was pleased with the temple? God gives King Solomon a gift and he builds the temple. Solomon knew he did not know how to rule the people wisely. He remembered that God had helped his father David. Now, Solomon knew he too needed God's help. Solomon took 1,000 burnt offerings to Gibeon and sacrificed them upon the altar. All day he watched them burning. As the smoke drifted upward, he prayed earnestly for God's help. When God came, he laid down to rest, but in his heart he was still praying for God's help. While he slept, Solomon had a wonderful dream. He saw God standing nearby. God said, I will give you anything you ask for. At once, Solomon thought about how much a good ruler needed to know. Because Solomon felt he was not wise in understanding, he answered, O Lord my God, you were with David, my father. You taught him how to follow your ways. You gave him a son to be king in his place. You have let me follow my father David as king, but I do not know how to be king. I rule so many people that I cannot count them. Give me, I pray you, an understanding heart. Then I shall be able to judge the people. Then I shall be able to tell the good from the bad.
God was well pleased with Solomon's request. He said, because you have asked for wisdom instead of a long life or riches or power over your enemies, I will give you what you asked for, and these things as well. No king in all the land will be as wise and rich and honorable as you. When Solomon awoke, he knew he had been dreaming, but he believed God had spoken to him while he slept. He went back to Jerusalem and gave more offerings before the ark of God. Then he gave a feast for all his servants. From that time on, Solomon judged the people wisely. They knew that God had blessed their king with great understanding. While David was king, he wanted to build a beautiful house. God did not want David to build the temple. God said, You have been a man of war. You may not build my house. Your son Solomon will be a man of peace.
When Solomon became king, he began work on the temple. First, he sent a letter to King Hiram of Tyre, a country by the sea. On the mountains of Lebanon in that country grew many beautiful cedar and fir trees. Solomon told Hiram, You know my father David could not build a house for the Lord because he was a man of war. Since we no longer have enemies to bother us, I plan to build the temple. Command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. I will be glad to pay your servants for their work, and my servants can help. Hiram had been a close friend of David's. Now he was glad to help David's son. He answered, My servants can cut down the trees. They will drag them to the sea and float them to a place where you can get them. You may pay us in food for this work.
Solomon agreed, and the men went to work on the coast, not far from Jerusalem. Solomon's men pulled the wet logs out of the sea and sawed them into boards, and Hiram and Solomon worked together and lived in peace. Meanwhile, Solomon had other men dig great stones out of the ground and cut them into the right shape for the foundation of the new building. He ordered that every stone should be cut to fit in place. When all the stones were ready, they were to be brought to Jerusalem. Building the temple was such a big job that it took thousands of men to do the work. Every part of the building was fitted together. Without using a single hammer or nail, it took 7 years to finish the building.
When the building was finished, Solomon called all the men of Israel to come to Jerusalem for the dedication. He took them to the house of God and offered many sacrifices among the great altar of brass. From Mount Zion, they brought the ark of God and placed it in the inner room where only the high priest could go. Other furniture that had been in Moses' tabernacle was placed in the temple as God had commanded. When the priest carried the ark of God and the other furniture into the building, God's presence filled the temple with a cloud just as it had the tabernacle many years before. By the sign, all the people knew that God was pleased with the house that Solomon had built.
At the dedication, Solomon prayed and asked God's blessing always to rest upon the temple. He asked that God always hear each prayer for forgiveness that was said there. When all the people had worshiped, he dismissed them and sent them back to their homes. After the temple was finished, God spoke to Solomon in a dream. He said, "If you will follow my ways as your father David did, if you will keep my laws and do my commands, I will bless you and your children forever. If your children turn away from me to worship other gods, then I will despise this house you have built, and I will allow other nations to take the kingdom, and much sorrow will come to the people."
Now let's answer the questions from earlier. Number 1, how did God speak to Solomon at Gibeon? In a dream. Number 2, what did Solomon ask God for? Wisdom to rule the people well. Number 3, why was God unwilling for King David to build the temple? Because King David had been a man of war. Number 4, where did Solomon get wood for the temple building? In the mountain of Lebanon. Number 5, how many years did it take to finish the great temple? It took 7 years. And number 6, what sign did God send so the people would know he was pleased with the temple? God filled the temple with a cloud of glory. This week's memory verse is James 1:5. If any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Think about it. The smartest teenager in the world.
One fine day, 4 people were flying in a small 4-passenger plane: a pilot, a minister, and 2 teenagers, one of whom had just won an award for being the smartest teenager in the world. As they were flying along, the pilot turned to the 3 passengers and said, "I've got some bad news, and I've got some worse news. The bad news is we're out of gas. The plane's going down. We're going to crash. The worst news is I only have 3 parachutes on board."
This meant, of course, that someone would have to go down with the plane. The pilot continued, "I have a wife and 3 children at home. I have many responsibilities. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to take one of the parachutes." With that, he grabbed one of the chutes and jumped out of the plane. The smartest teenager in the world was next to speak. "I'm the smartest teenager in the world," he said. "I might be the one who comes up with the cure for cancer or even COVID-19. Or I might be able to solve the world's economic problems. Everyone is counting on me." The smartest teenager in the world grabbed a second parachute and jumped. The minister then spoke up and said, "Son, you take the last parachute. I've made my peace with God, and I'm willing to go down with the plane. Now take the last parachute and go." "Relax, Reverend," said the other teenager. "The smartest teenager in the world jumped out of the plane with my backpack." Application.
A lot of kids think they're pretty smart. In reality, they're a lot like the smartest teenager in the world. They jump out into the world without parachutes. They think they know it all and have all they need to live happy and fulfilled lives to keep them from crashing and burning. What they actually have is a backpack. The only parachute that will ultimately save is the gospel of Christ. All other ways are false and lead to death. Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." A lot of smart kids haven't learned how to make wise decisions. They act impulsively without thinking. The result is sometimes the same as what happened to the smartest teenager in the world. And our memory verse for today is appropriate. It says, "If any of you lack wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." James 1:5.
This concludes today's lesson.